What's up guys, Will Gibbons here, and today we're doing something a little bit different. This will be the first video in a 3-part free mini-series that's going to walk you through everything you know to get the basics of KeyShot down. This should be helpful for both brand new users and experienced KeyShot users alike. I plan on going over lots of little tips and tricks that took me a long time to learn. This first video is going to be all about importing your model and getting the materials to look great. The next video is going to be all about building out a scene. We're going to take our model and we're going to put it in a room and accessorize it, and I'm going to show you an easy way to do that with KeyShot. The third video is going to be all about lighting. We're going to talk about creating dynamic lighting and all sorts of, again, tips and tricks that I've figured out that saved me a lot of time and I think will save you a lot of time. Without further ado, make sure you subscribe because you're going to want to follow along on all the videos which are going to drop one week after another. So yeah, let's get into the tutorial. Before the tutorial begins, make sure you head on over to willgibbons.com/downloads to get your project files so you can follow along with today's tutorial. Once you've unzipped your project files folder, grab the molded plywood chair step file and drag that into KeyShot and take the default import settings. Great. Now, one thing I notice is my aspect ratio of my real-time view is already set to square. If yours is something different, go up to Image, Resolution Presets, and then choose 1:1. The next thing I want to do is change my perspective on my camera up here at 50 to something like 80, just so I have a little less distortion on here. Now I want to make sure that I've got an environment that has a little more contrast than our startup environment. If we take the startup environment, which is set by default, our materials are going to lack the contrast and realism that they generally need. So I'll go into the environment library, and I'm just going to go ahead and use the 3-panel straight 4K, which is my default go-to. At this point, I'll hit C on the keyboard to go to a white background, and now we can start working on our materials. Let's go ahead and start with the simplest stuff first. I'll double click on the leg of the chair, and we see it's a white diffuse material. I want to change it from diffuse down to metal. And right away we get what looks like a chrome material, which is a pretty good starting point. Now the feet or the gliders are still gray because they're not linked to the rest of these. So with these guys, I'm going to double click on these little feet gliders and change them down to a plastic material. So now we have kind of a white or a light gray plastic glider, or at least a painted metal. That's what this kind of looks like. And then when we look on the back of the chair here, we also have some screws and some rubber bushings. So these screws, I'm going to make them the same material as our metal here. So I'll hold Shift on the keyboard and left click once on the metal bar. I've copied that material to the clipboard. Shift, right click is going to paste and link that material to these screws. And we actually have a couple more underneath. So if we zoom in, we can see here, there's one. And we have a couple more up front. So I'm holding Shift and right clicking on those. Now those are all linked together. Let's go ahead and just apply a basic material on the rest of this first. So I will double click the bushing here and change it from diffuse down to plastic. And we're going to make this just a basic rubber material. So we'll go ahead and set it to be a dark gray. Let's make sure this is on screen. So we'll go to HSV mode, and I would just want this to be like a 10% black or so. And I'll take the specular down a little bit, so it's not quite as shiny. And I'll set my roughness to 0.2 to make it very dull. And again, good enough for now. We're just getting started. Now I have some specific textures I want to use for the chair seat pan and back, so we are not going to do that quite yet. Let's go ahead and resolve this metal material. I want to introduce you guys to the material graph if you haven't used it yet. Before that though, if we zoom in really close, we might find that the screw heads have these sharp 90-degree angles. These don't have rounds or fillets on them. So we need to fix that. And what I'm going to do is grab the entire model by clicking this top level here, go down under the scene tree, find the option called rounded edges and add 0.1 millimeter and hit enter. And then what you should see is some rounded edges where there weren't any. Now, the other thing that I want to do is, like I said, use some textures to break up this chrome surface. So I'm going to double click on here and we're going to get into the material graph. So that's this button right under the name of this material. So double click, then material graph. Next, we want to right click and we're going to get a texture for the roughness. And I'm going to use something called granite. This is a good kind of random looking texture. If I hit C on the keyboard, you'll see it and everything turns kind of brownish. Well, let's go ahead and change the color of this texture to white. And now it's got some white and some gray. And it's this really big procedural texture. So we're going to take our scale and scale this down a lot. There we go, somewhere around 120 or so. And what we're going to do is we're going to control the roughness with this texture. Now, if I click and drag from this white dot on the right side of this texture node and plug it into the metal texture, say color, the color of the metal inherits its color from this texture. If I put this into the bump channel, you see the whole thing gets bumpy. And now instead of that, what I want to do is hover over the middle of this metal node, let go, and go down to roughness. And the whole thing gets super, super dull. Well, that's okay, but what we want to do is now make it so it's not quite so rough. And we're going to do this by adding a utility node between this granite and this metal. Right click on the connector, go down to utilities, and use color to number. This is a nice little node that allows us to control the black and white values of this texture independently quite easily. So we're going to hit C on the keyboard to preview our color to number. And what that's doing is it's showing the color of this granite and the effect of this node. If we change the color to number, we will see a change in the texture preview. Let's go ahead and set that back to 1. So what we're looking at with these values, the whiter or the brighter this texture, the more rough metal is going to be. The darker, the more smooth it will be. So we want to basically darken the white values. All I have to do that is grab this output 2 and start sliding it to the left, and the whole texture gets darker. And if I get out of this preview by hitting C, you will see that it's now less dull, whereas if we crank it to the right, it gets more matte. So we're basically bringing the shininess, or the roughness, I guess, back down a little bit. And if we get into this preview once again, the other thing I want to do is take my output from, which is that controlling that black value, and I want to increase it just a little bit, just so it's not pure black. And if we zoom in, it still looks too rough, so we're going to have to get very, very low with these two values. So I'll take my output 2 and type in 0.05, 0.02, and then I'll take my output from and say 0.01. And just right there, we should have just enough roughness to create some variation on the surface of this metal. If that's not quite enough, well, let's go to output of 0.03. I think that looks pretty good. The other thing I want to do is add a tiny little texture in there as well. Again, maybe overkill, just depends on how much detail you like. I'm going to right click, go to textures, and plug in a noise texture. I'm going to find the bump channel of the metal, plug it in, take this noise texture down to 0.5, and take the bump height down to 0.05, 0.02 maybe. And again, that should be just enough. From a distance, it should read pretty much chrome, but as we get close, we're going to want to see a little bit of imperfection in there. Good. Last but not least, I want to take the color of this metal, and I don't want it to be pure chrome. You can tell it's not pure white, but I'm going to bring it down just a bit further yet. I think right about there is good. Okay, let's move on to another part. Let's talk about this rubber bushing. Right in here, I'm going to do something quite similar. We'll double click on the rubber bushing, pop in the material graph. We're going to grab that same texture, which is the granite, double click on it, set its color to white, go ahead and plug it into the roughness. If we hit C to preview it, bring it down to 100. Let's go even smaller than that. Let's go down to right about 50. And then we're going to use, if you guessed it, you're catching on quickly, it's going to be a color 2 number once again. C to preview and bring that output 2 down. And we're going to, in this time, we're going to bring the input from up a little bit as well to make those black areas a little bit bigger. And then let's get out of our preview. We'll have shiny parts and less shiny parts. If it's hard to tell that they're matte, bring your output to a little higher. And then we want to take our output from and increase it just a hair, like 0.02. So now it should look like, you know, a rubber that's got like some like variable roughness on it. That's good enough for those, I think. Maybe a little bit more roughness. 0.03 and 0.06 will be my 2 values. And 0.3 at the top. Okay. Now, one thing I forgot to do that I wanted to do is actually use a texture to add some darkness in the crevices here, where the welds are between these bars and where the screw heads are. So we'll double click on this metal again and back in the material graph. We're going to get one more texture, and this one's going to be an occlusion texture. We'll hit C to preview that, and you'll see it gets dark in all the crevices. And what I want to do is take that radius and slide it down just a little bit so it's not quite so large. Notice as we get smaller, the gray pixels are only in these smaller areas. Let's bring it down to, say, 2 millimeters. There we go, much better. And I think that's really all we're going to need for this. And the other thing is, this is going to be the color of our metal. So let's take that unoccluded and bring it back down to like a mid-gray. Because that's, remember, we already darkened our metal. So when we plug this into color, we should see now that we get some darkened areas where you have, you know, more crevices and stuff. Depending on how weathered and worn you want to go, you could play more around with that and use it for a mask to add some grime in there. But we're not going to make this look too old and vintage. We're going to keep it fairly modern. I think we're looking pretty good on those 2 materials. Let's get to the main part, which is this wood here. Now, I have a couple of textures we're going to use here, one of which you're going to have to go download, one of which you've already downloaded. So let's start off with the seat pan. And what I'm going to do is drag my texture right into KeyShot and place it on the yellow area and put it on the color option. Now, this is a texture that I downloaded for free from textures.com. So the file that you've downloaded, your project files, you'll have a text document in there with a link to where you can download this from. You have to make a little username and then download it. But yes, it's a great resource, so it's worth doing anyway. Now, what we want to do is make some changes to this texture so it fits better. First of all, I want to unlink the seat pan from the back. So I'm going to let's actually select the seat pan first, right click it, and then unlink material. Then double click on it, and let's get into its material graph. So here, what we want to do is make a few changes to the mapping. So double click on your texture node. Mine is set to UV by default. Yours will probably be set to planar. And that's actually what we want. So we'll go to planar. If it's not already, make sure you set it to planar. And now mine is rotated correctly. And when I go to move the texture, you can see that's how it's laid out. Now, one thing, I will explain that you could go so far as to UV unwrap this. This is a fairly flat object. I know there's some curvature, but the texture's not getting stretched too crazy much. So I'm not going to bother UV unwrapping this. Although perhaps in another tutorial, I will address that. However, KeyShot's UV unwrapping tools are still pretty new, and I'd like to see them mature a little bit, and as well as get some more experience with them before I do a full tutorial on them. That said, I think this works just great using planar mapping. The only thing that I want to do is make a few adjustments. Notice how this looks kind of skinny. I actually want to stretch the texture wider. So I'm going to hit the blue chain link near the width and height to unconstrain them. And I want to stretch the width to be wider than the height. So I'm going to set the top one to 900 and the height to 1200. And so I'm basically scaling this whole thing up, and I'm also making sure it's a little wider. And then when I'm done, I want to click this chain link to accept that size. So that's quite important. So this is looking good. Now I've got a couple more textures I want to use. I want to use the roughness and the normal map, which came with this download. So again, you have to get these from textures.com, but you can drag these into your KeyShot material graph next. And what we can do is we can plug the roughness value into the diffuse texture node, put it into, let's convert our diffuse to a plastic first. Once it's a plastic, now we can use our roughness texture and drag it onto the plastic and then choose roughness. And then we want to use our normal map and do the same, but we want to plug it into bump. Normal map is just a fancy kind of bump texture. So at this point, what I want to do is make a couple of minor adjustments. Okay, so one thing I want to do is actually modify this roughness texture. I'm going to insert a utility node, and it's going to be the color to number, C to preview, and I want more contrast between these, and I also want the wood to look shinier. So I'm actually going to darken the value. So I'm going to take the output to down just a little bit, but mostly bring the input from up a little bit as well. And so if we get out of that preview, we should see now we have a little bit more of a shiny, more satin finish instead of more of like a matte finish. That's what I was looking for. So I'm happy with that. And if I zoom in, I think my normal map, I might want it to be a little stronger. So I'll set my bump height to 1.5, just to have a little bit more of a tooth to it. That's looking pretty good. Now, if you want to make some adjustments on the color, this is a very personal preference item, but what you can do is right click on this connector, go to utilities and do a color adjust. From here, we can do stuff like reduce the saturation a little bit. So we can go for a little less of that like brown wood color. We can also darken it a little bit. We can make it more like a rich color. And then we can even go to colorize and we can add a tint. So if I want it to be like a darker, redder look, I can add a little bit of red and it's going to darken and make that a little bit more red as well. I don't want to go too crazy. But now one thing I wanted to point out to you, if we start going and making changes to the scale of this, like let's say I wanted to increase or decrease it, these other two nodes, let's see, this normal map, do you see how it still says 900 and 1200? And then this one over here says 900 and 1200. And then this one is like much larger. They're not automatically syncing anymore because we have these utilities in here. So just if you're curious as to how you can control multiple textures sizes with one number or node, you can go to a texture. I think actually under utilities, we're going to use mapping 2D, and we're going to plug this into our 3 texture nodes. And when we go ahead and do this, we should be able to go into mapping 2D, make sure its mapping type is set to planar, and then set our dimensions here. This will be 900 and 1200. We have to unconstrain them for that, and then reconstrain them. And then the last thing I want to do is make sure that the 3 textures are actually inheriting their value from this mapping node. So we're going to change the mapping type to node on all 3 of these. And what that does is it basically tells each texture to take its coordinates and its scaling from this one guy here. So now, anytime you're using a bunch of utilities, that breaks the link or the sync between all of these textures that we have. So you can use a mapping node to sync those together, which is really great. So here's our intelligent material, very flexible, easy to edit. We're going to close this and we're going to copy and paste it onto the back here. So shift left click to copy, control shift right click to paste it as a copy onto the back here. Now, the last thing we have to do, we pasted it as a copy because we want to change the mapping just on the back. because these are on different planes. One's going up and down, one's going left and right. So let's double click on the back, pop it in the material graph, and then our mapping 2D node, double click that, remember? And then we're gonna hit move texture and see it's on the wrong plane. We're gonna rotate this holding shift to snap if you need to. And then you can just change your move tool to show the translate handles if it's not showing. Move this so it's kind of in line with the back of the chair. Doesn't have to be perfect, just close enough. And there we go. We have our beautiful material. You know how to use a material graph now if that's the first time. Good job. Okay, last but not least, this is typically a challenge here. Anytime you need to get something like a wood grain to follow a path like this that's not planar, you typically run into challenges with KeyShot, and this is what UV mapping is for. You use UV mapping to tell an image texture to follow a complex path that's not based off of a basic shape like a cylinder or a sphere or a box. Now in this case, I modeled this in Fusion 360 using a plane, and then I actually thickened it. And by doing so, we don't actually need to do anything in KeyShot to UV map our texture. I'll show you what I mean here. You need to grab your Plywood Edge seamless texture, which should be in your project files. You're going to drag it into KeyShot and place it right on the edge of your seat pan and place it in the color spot. Now, when we zoom in, we want to, let's actually double click on the edge here, change your material from diffuse to plastic, and then we want to go into our material graph and double click on our Plywood Edge texture. And we're going to change it. Actually, we're not going to change it. If yours is on planar, make sure it's on UV. Mine is UV by default. And then what you want to do is we want to scale it up so it's bigger. So as I start to drag the scale, we see it's a bunch of parallel lines. And then we want to go to angle UV. This rotates the texture around its midpoint. So just type in 90 and hit enter. And now what you should be seeing is this Plywood Edge texture following all the way around the model. Now, once again, if you don't model your 3D data in a certain way, this will not work. And then you'll have to resort to using UV mapping to compensate for this. Again, I can't get into that for this tutorial, but for a future tutorial, if you like, I'm more than happy to. Just comment below. Now, in this case, I want to scale this down just a little bit. So we're going to take our width and we'll set it to something like 30. And last but not least, I want to add a utility node between these two. We're going to use a color adjust. All I want to do is desaturate it a little bit and increase the value a little bit. So it's a little bit lighter. Actually, I'm going to take the contrast down too. So it gets lighter as you reduce the contrast. That's okay. I don't want to see those plies as much here. So I'm bringing them down to like, let's say 0.5, and then I'll say the value is 1.2, and our saturation's 0.9. And last but not least, we want to go ahead and close that out. On this material, let's set a roughness of 0.1 or 0.2. We're gonna make it very like matte finish. And crazy thing is, once again, by doing, by the way I modeled this and also the way I assign my materials having the same color on the side for both the back and the seat pan, they both end up looking the same. The material's like identical at this point. To close this out, we're gonna hit Control G as in ground plane to add a ground plane, and it'll get a little fuzzy on the ground there. Go to your lighting tab and make sure you're in product mode if you want the best looking results when you go to do your final rendering. I'm going to hit the render button down here, and I will render out as a PNG for the highest quality. That means non-compressed. And then we're going to set the resolution. In my case, 2560 by 2560 is pretty large, but I think I'm okay with that. For my samples or my quality, maybe I'll render this out at 300 just to be safe. I'll hit render, and there you guys have it. I hope you enjoyed this one. Nothing too crazy yet, but again, we're building the foundation for what I think is going to be a really fun series. And if you are new here, do me a big favor. Check out that playlist I mentioned that says, if you're new here, start here. Those are some of the most popular and most helpful videos. I think you're really going to enjoy them. Until next time, guys, happy rendering.